How are you doing?
Okay. I'm good, Roberto. How are you? Thanks for talking with me today.
Oh no, thank you for taking the time. So, how are things going?
I think they're going as well as they can be for people, navigating this particular crisis. I'm very lucky. My wife and I have decent paying jobs. We're able to work from home. We actually worked from home, both of us, for several years before the crisis hit. So, and our kids are healthy and they're handling all of this well, with the learning from home in their school and all the other things. So we have nothing really to really complain about. A lot of people are suffering a lot more than my family is. That's for sure. We're trying to do what we can to support local businesses. We do restaurant takeout a couple of times a week. We've bought a lot of books from our independent bookstore, trying to find ways to stimulate our local economy and local businesses, while at the same time, following stay-at-home orders and being safe and wearing masks in public and all that stuff.
So, what is that you do?
So I've been a journalist for about 15 years, almost 16 years. 15, we'll say 15 years. I started working as a journalist in 2005. The majority of that time I've spent in public media, mostly in public radio stations. I was a reporter, talk show host, news director, program director for several different public radio stations around the country. And now I lead an organization called Public Media Journalists Association. It's an organization that supports journalists essentially working in public radio throughout the country. We have about 110 stations who are members. Our membership is station-based around the country. I served on the board of directors for the organization for 5 years before becoming the organization's first executive director in 2018.
Wonderful. So I want to talk to you also because Theater for Social Change, and because we have collaborated on a project on homelessness in San Antonio about
Yes.
10, 12 years ago. It was a long time ago. It was a wonderful project. But also in this project, performing human rights, I'm focusing on the artists, and I noticed that due to the COVID-19, the artists are those that have lost their voices because most of the funding has been cut. But they didn't really lose their voices, because considering the conversation I had so far, the artists are working. But I wanted to talk to you also as a journalist, because what I see happening in this country and all over the world, in Italy too, for instance, is that also the journalists are losing their voices. And what they seem to be losing is the trust of the public toward the information that the journalists share. And it seems to be a very, it's a big problem, because here is not about the journalists not being able to report, but the oppression is a little bit subtle, because the reporting is being allowed, but the quality and the truth of the reporting is being questioned. It's a human rights challenge here. Would you like to elaborate on that, and what has been your experience? What is your feeling about this?
Well, I agree with you 100%. It is a human rights violation on a number of different levels. And journalists are not only mistrusted, they are mistreated and abused by the public in lots of ways. And unfortunately, we have a president who not only encourages that behavior, but leads by example and treats journalists on a daily basis in the way that he's dubbed journalists enemies of the people, as many totalitarian dictators in the past have. Free press is really an essential cornerstone to our democracy. If we don't have a press that can operate freely, then we have issues with how centralized and harmful power bases in the country can become. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different things here. There's the battle of disinformation, right? And it's part of living in the 21st century with the amount of information and the multiple avenues in which information travels. And you know, it comes down to our sense of human nature as well, where, you know, we are more interested as a people sometimes in believing information that suits us or that in some way satisfies us emotionally, but isn't necessarily factual, right? You know, there have been lots of disinformation, lots of disinformation efforts by smaller groups parading as journalists. You know, I went to Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. It's more than a century old. It was founded by Joseph Pulitzer, who was a newspaper man in New York. Of course, his name bears the Pulitzer Prizes, which come out of Columbia's journalism school. But I remember in one of my first classes, you know, I took classes on media law and on media ethics at the school. And I remember once in our ethics classes on the first day, Steve Isaacs, who at the time had been, he's not with us anymore, unfortunately. He was an amazing journalist. He was a longtime journalist and producer with CBS News before he became a professor at Columbia. And he got up in front of the crowd and he said, the class, there's about, I don't know, 200 of us in the class in this lecture hall. And he got up in front of us and said, you know, in this country, you need a license to practice law, you need a license to practice medicine, but you don't need a license to practice journalism. That doesn't mean that you should be unethical in the way that you practice it. And so that's how he sort of framed the beginning of that class. And, you know, journalists that are dedicated to the craft on an ethical level are dedicated because they know that any misuse of that medium, any misuse of that craft can be harmful. But the flip side of that is that, you know, a lot of people can parade around as journalists, saying that they're journalists when they're not. They're not basing their reporting on facts. They're not fact checking. They're not doing any kind of accurate reporting. They're not bringing in all different sides of the story. They're parading disinformation as journalism, often to satisfy the emotional needs or desires of an audience. And unfortunately, some journalistic outlets have sort of pushed into that realm. Not always, but, you know, we've seen cable news sources on both sides of the political spectrum cater to different audiences, you know, motivated mostly by revenue, by advertising dollars, and a 24-hour news cycle where so much content has to be pumped into a 24-hour news cycle. There's not enough factual news to sort of cover that, so you start pulling yourself into sort of editorializing and commentary. And again, that can be done ethically and that can be done correctly. And most of the time it is, sometimes it's not. I'm fortunate to work in an area of journalism that's nonprofit, right? Public media has been nonprofit, you know, since the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was an organization that was brought in by a legislative act that was signed by President Johnson in the 1960s. So, and I've worked, you know, in organizations that have been funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, not completely funded by a long shot, you know, fractionally funded, under 10%, still receive money from that organization that allow it to do the kinds of accurate and ethical journalism and reporting without the pressure of trying to earn advertising dollars. You know, that's part of the reason that newspapers have sort of fallen off the planet in lots of ways, right? Their economic demise really has to do with the model that they tied themselves to keep themselves afloat, which was advertising dollars. One of the beautiful things happening in journalism, it's like a small flower coming up in the desert is that there are more and more nonprofit news organizations that are emerging, more journalists, more incredible journalists who have been, not been able to sustain their craft or their livelihood through older models like traditional newspapers, have formed nonprofit organizations. The Texas Tribune is one in Texas, which has been around now for more than a decade, which focuses on state politics. It has pulled in a similar model to public media, where it goes to its audience and says, okay, we're doing this story, we're providing this content for free, but if you are willing to pay for it, would you pay something? And in public radio, that manifests itself in the public radio fund drive that happens every 4 to 6 months. At stations I've been at, we stop regular programming when we get on and we say, okay, we're working really hard for you. How much is this worth to you? And in public radio stations around the country, nearly 80% of the funding that the station survives off of comes from listener and member donations. And some people give, a small amount of money. Some people give a large amount of money. Some people, like myself, give a fixed amount of money every month indefinitely. So that's gratifying as a journalist to know that you're reaching your audience. It's also gratifying as a journalist to know that your audience is supporting you. You're not subordinate to another organization that has motives of profit or other kinds of motives that's supporting you. That's really important.
So you, as a journalist, in this environment where your story may be questioned, how do you approach the story? And are you writing for a specific audience, that audience that will not question your story? I mean, it seems quite challenging. It's and it's similar to the work of the artist. Artists, we have a specific audience that follows us, and there is that idea of the niche audience. And then out of that, we hope to expand our message, our work to a bigger audience, right? And here what happened is that there was a larger audience, and now we went into the niche audiences. But while a niche audience for an artist is a good thing, because it's really is a relationship with a specific group of people, I think that for a journalist, a niche audience does not prevents for a healthy dialogue and exchange. Yeah,
you're right. You're right, it does. I think a couple of things. One, I think what artists and journalists have in common, and these worlds do interweave, especially in broadcast journalism, when you're working with video or when you're working with audio, or what I like to call sort of the tools of the trade, right? When you've got all these things in your toolbox that you have to tell a story, you're striving to bring to life the story of an individual. In a journalism fashion, it's often based on fact. It's you're trying to tell all sides of it. There's a group of people out there that for one reason or another have decided that they don't support what you do, and they're more interested in sort of campaigns of disinformation or campaigns to sort of try to question your credibility as a journalist. And really, the one way to react to that is to stand up and say, according to the U.S. Constitution, I have a right to do this. I'm a part of a free press in this country that has the right to operate under the First Amendment. Second, you sit back on your facts. I mean, a person who's arguing against facts may be loud, they may be disorderly, they may be rude, they may be threatening, they may be harmful, but at the end of the day, the facts remain. The facts are what they are. One of the sister organizations that is in my universe, the Society of Professional Journalists, I was at their conference actually in San Antonio in September, and they were holding a fundraiser, and they had these T-shirts that had kind of the Star Wars logo, and it said, stand with the facts is what it's, I'm sorry, stand with the first, which was the First Amendment. So it had the Star Wars logo, stand with the first. And then in the back, as often, happens in the Star Wars movies, there's the preamble that comes rising across the screen. In the back of the shirt, the preamble that was rising across the shirt was the First Amendment of the Constitution. So, I think the point there is that, journalists feel like, the facts for them are the force, right? They are an unquestionable power for dramatic effect, an unquestionable pillar, cornerstone of what we do. And if our journalism is rooted in facts, it's done ethically, we're presenting all sides of the story, then we'll stand by that no matter how hard we're challenged. But again, we're in a very delicate time in our society. And so, many people, including our president, have gone from disputing a journalist's story to disputing a journalist's integrity to openly threatening to harm journalists physically and emotionally. And that kind of language is resonating because when some people hear the president say that the press is the American or the enemy of the people, and that you're a horrible journalist, you're a horrible person, that's dog whistle language. There are people who go out there, especially on social media, behind the shield of anonymity, and personally attack journalists, many female journalists, many journalists of color. They'll find ways to exploit and threaten and intimidate those people.
Do you know, has this happened to you? And do you know of colleagues that you know personally that went through a form of harassment or the inability to do their job, or they risked their lives? Would you mind sharing one or two stories that you might know?
I have not. I mean, for about the last about the last 9 years, I've been managing journalists and editor. Haven't been in the field that much, and when I have, I've luckily been in environments that aren't so hostile. Aside from angry emails attacking my character or my station, or angry phone calls from individuals who really aren't interested in the solution, but just interested in trying to instigate some kind of bogus argument, in other words, trying to intimidate. That's the only level, and fortunately for me, that I've dealt with it on. Now, I know a lot of people who have dealt with much worse. There was a kind of at the beginning of the Me Too movement, there were a group of female journalists, some from NPR, some from other places, who started sharing on social media some of the horrific tweets that they had received from individuals. And they were incredibly demeaning, incredibly intimidating, things that just you couldn't imagine another human being saying to another, especially to a woman. And unfortunately, that's not uncommon. That happens a lot. My organization had a conference in Washington, D.C. last year, and we had an event where we featured several Black female journalists in a talk. Several of them covered the White House. April Ryan, Aisha Roscoe, Cornish from NPR was the moderator. And to hear what they went through every day as African-American women in this country covering the White House, not just inside the press room, being berated and belittled by President Trump, but it's all the stuff that happened on the outside, all of the attacks on social media, all of the threats, the death threats. April Ryan talked about several death threats she had gotten whenever she, confronted the president at a press conference. And unfortunately, we have a leader who thrives off of this kind of vitriolic energy. He's interested in dividing and conquering, and that's literally sort of his modus operandi here. And so, but whether again, his actions and his words have consequences, and they've created an incredibly hostile environment for journalists. The Radio Television Digital News Association, which is another sort of sister organization of mine, it was formed by Edward R. Murrow when he was at CBS News. It used to be called the Radio Television News Directors Association. They changed the name to Radio Television Digital News Association. But they have a very strong advocacy campaign against harassment of journalists. There was a T-shirt that has been floating around, and it says, "Rope, tree, journalist, some assembly required."
Huh.
And this shirt was being sold at Walmart. This shirt was being sold on Amazon. And I've seen people wearing this shirt from afar. And that's a horrific message that you're sending. You're sending, you're saying that, whether you believe this to be a joke or not, you're saying that it's okay to lynch journalists, essentially, to silence them, right? That they have no place in society that's important. And RTDNA staged a successful letter writing campaign or email writing campaign to those retailers, and they don't carry the shirt anymore. They took, not that I'm sure there's some dark corner of the internet where you can get a hold of it. And I have seen journalists who see this in public, they'll post a picture of it. They won't identify the person, they won't harass the person, but they'll just say, look, this is still out there, right? This is still the way that people think of journalists. So, we're in a very critical time. There are people who are advocating violence against journalists, and not just emotional violence, which is happening a lot more frequently, but physical violence. It's a very, very delicate time.
So do you think that the reader in general is aware of the condition under which a journalist works nowadays?
Can you repeat that question? You cut out for a second.
Do you think that the reader is aware of the condition under which a journalist operates on a daily basis?
I don't know. Again, sometimes journalists aren't the best advocates for themselves, right? There's a tendency in journalism that we don't want to make ourselves part of the story. Feel uncomfortable about that. We don't want ourselves to be the focus of the story. We want our work to be the focus of the story. And so, I think there's more of a tendency to ignore it or not let it infiltrate our work, as opposed to standing up to it more often. I think that at a certain point, you have to stand up to it, especially when someone is threatening your livelihood, your physical body, your family, those kinds of things, and you have to stand up to it. But there's an inherent distrust of journalists outside of the folks that are being, sort of voraciously violent on different levels about their feelings about journalists and journalism. I think journalists could do a better job, raising that stuff to the surface. SPJ, RTDNA, my organization to a certain extent advocates for the safety of journalists. There's a lot of resources inside our organizations. Every conference now has some session dedicated to safety of journalists, especially when covering the presidential election or presidential election cycle. But does the reader know? That's a good question. I think we could do more as a group in our society to do that more. I think people think of journalists being shot and killed as happening in places like Russia and Syria and other totalitarian regimes. I don't think journalists are being openly killed, but I think journalists' lives are being threatened on a level that we haven't seen in this country in a very long time, if ever. And only a generation ago, journalists were some of the most trusted people in this country. Walter Cronkite was an incredibly trusted person. Watergate played itself out in the way that it did in the 1970s, largely because people trusted the work of Woodward and Bernstein, right? But we had a situation with our president being impeached for several impeachable offenses, and there was a whole political party that just stood in the face of truth and denied it over and over and over again. Because their numbers were greater, they succeeded. But that didn't stop journalists from doing their job. Didn't stop journalists from asking difficult questions. So I guess back to your question. Sorry, I get off on these tangents. I don't know. I think that journalists could do a better job. Our organizations like mine and PMJA and SPJ and RTDNA, all these acronyms. These are professional organizations that support journalists. So there's a certain amount of advocacy we do. My organization is gotten latched on to some of these advocacy efforts from SPJ and RTDNA. But there's not, again, I don't think there's enough in the sphere of the general public, and I think that's just part of an idiosyncratic feeling with journalists, right? Again, we don't really want to make ourselves the story. There is an example, and there's several, but there's an example that comes to mind rather recently when Mary Louise Kelly, who is an anchor for All Things Considered on NPR, did an interview with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and was, at the end of the interview, verbally abused by him. And she had the courage to go back and she had the courage to get on the air and talk about that. I happened to be at NPR talking with some other individuals who weren't connected with that situation just a few days after it happened. But who, gave me some information about, how Mary Louise came back to got the CEO of NPR into a room, told him what had happened. They made a decision that, yeah, it was important to bring this to the public. But there was this decision, which I'm sure Mary Louise was struggling with. She had gone through this traumatic event, but she was more concerned about the way that Pompeo's behavior set a precedent for other public officials to treat journalists, and she thought it was important that the public know about that. And that took a lot of courage. This administration, practices retribution often and very effectively. And so, so Mary Louise not only went through that traumatic experience of being verbally abused by the Secretary of State for asking basic questions, she then had to get on the air and talk about that. And I'm sure that was stressful for her and difficult, but she saw the greater good in that. She wanted the public to know that this person of enormous power and stature had demeaned a journalist, demeaned a female journalist. He did say several sexist things to her and basically tried to verbally intimidate her into feeling that she was doing something wrong. She wasn't. She was in the right. So that's an example of a journalist stepping up and saying, okay, it's important that the public know that this happened. They know that they know my side of the story. And so that was important. But again, I think you're right. I don't think that there are enough examples. But as we know in our society too, though, more information, more factual information, more truthful information doesn't always tip the scales to people saying, oh, okay, you're right. This is really happening. There's going to be a population and a faction of people who are going to push against it regardless.
Right. So just to conclude here, so we are experiencing this crisis of COVID-19. And from what I understand, this is the first time that the whole world is having a similar experience. Of course, it changes from because of geography and political conditions, but we are all dealing with this COVID-19. So more than an irrational response to that, what is a more subconscious response? In other words, what are the symbols that in your mind will stay with us, will the images, the symbols that will stay with us and will inform really this common experience that we have, and maybe the same symbols allow us to move forward.
Yeah, yeah.
More abstract question, but we have to deal also with the emotional, psychological impact of this experience.
Yeah. I think the symbol is that, you know, everybody is having to experience sacrifice, self-sacrifice on some level. For some, it's relatively minor. For others, it's extraordinary. You know, and then there's a conflict over that self-sacrifice as to, especially in our country. You know, some people believe that their own personal freedoms to move around society and to patronize businesses and be in public places on their own terms is more important than the health guidelines that are out there to make sure others are safe. And so as a planet, for the first time in more than a generation, everyone on the planet, and you know, and they're struggling with it in our country, obviously, is saying, you know, is being asked to follow a simple set of guidelines, not just to protect yourself, but to protect others from you. And it on the surface, it seems so basic. On the surface, it seems like compared to what other generations have experienced in our country during wars and other crises, to what people in other countries have been enduring for years, with war and famine and other kinds of serious problems. You know, there's the sense that, you know, can we in our country as Americans handle, you know, what for many is a very small level of adversity, to continue to try to move us through this crisis. So at some point we can get things moving again. We can move back to some kind of normal life. But there are competing factors, you know, that are going on there. I'm lucky that I'm not unemployed, and I'm lucky that I didn't, you know, open a restaurant 6 months ago. I'm lucky that I don't face some of the economic pressures that many people are facing right now, and I understand that. Could we do more as a country, both on a government level and more on a social level, to help those people? Absolutely. But we have to come together on what those could be, what those objectives could be, and we have to put our differences aside, all of them, and say we have one objective here: it's to get ourselves through this conflict as whole as possible with the least amount of harm as possible. And we've done that as a nation before, but this generation, the people on this planet now, have never been called to do that on any level. And again, we're so sort of ideologically fractured in our society that it's more comfortable for people to say, I'm not going to break the rules. I'm going to break the rules. The rules don't apply to me. As saying, you know what, I can make the sacrifices I need in my life to make so that the health and safety of others is protected, even on just the basic level of wearing a face covering. I think that's probably the symbol that I'll remember the most from this, is just how difficult it is for some people to wear a mask in public. I ventured out with my family to a town about 50 miles away to see my brother-in-law and his family, who just arrived in that town this past week. We went to a park, and we were all wearing masks. Probably 80% of the people in that park were not wearing masks. And I just, I'm not going to disparage anybody for making a choice, because I don't think that's my role. But at the same time, I'm wondering, why isn't that person wearing a mask? What is the sacrifice? Why is that sacrifice to wear a mask so distasteful? That person feels that he or she should not wear a mask. So, and then of course, so there's that on a local level, and then on a national level, we see our president not wear a mask on Memorial Day when he is giving a dedication to our fallen soldiers, our fallen military service members, and we see the Democratic candidate Joe Biden wear a mask. But then we see, people parading as journalists and others, criticizing Joe Biden for wearing a mask, and the president, jumps onto that same kind of criticism. So it is disheartening on an enormous level for me that we can't even come together on some basic things we need to do to get through this crisis as a people. So I think the conflict over wearing a mask will be something that I'll remember deeply from this.
So in addition to the mask and then the graphic of the Corona COVID-19, what is another image that is symbolic of these times, just to finish up our conversation?
So another image besides those two?
Yeah.
It's a morbid one, but I think images of the dead. I mean, images of one image that sticks with me is an image I saw in the New York Times of large refrigerator trucks parked outside the hospital in Elmhurst, Queens, and knowing that those are filled with individuals who've lost their lives. Even in the time of COVID, Roberto, it's easy for people in lots of ways to shelter themselves from the real images of this. And unless they're touched by 1 or 2 degrees of separation, it's easy for people to deny that this is happening. In less than 10 weeks, 100,000 people in this country have died. We've had more people die in this country than any other country in the world. We're still vacillating on what the solutions are, yet we're pushing to reopen because of economic pressures. We're in a very, very difficult place. And we're already paying for the mistakes that have been made in the past while continuing to make mistakes moving forward. And so, and the result of that will be more people dying at staggering levels. And I think the thing that's the most disheartening is that, that's preventable. We've seen other countries prevent it by taking a more measured approach, by taking a more unified approach. I think that, images of death, on a scale that, again, people in this country haven't experienced in a generation, but because of how we live in this part of the 21st century, people can shut their eyes to it. And that's unfortunate. They should be looking at those photographs. They should be making decisions based on the people who've sacrificed their lives. Some people got this disease because they were at a gathering somewhere, or, the disease got them by surprise. But many people, gave their lives in this fight trying to save others. I mean, the healthcare workers that have lost their lives, it's heartbreaking. And they range in age from, early 20s to 70s. I mean, I think in the beginning we were trying to compartmentalize this as, it preys on the elderly and the people with weak immune systems, and that's not true. Anybody who gets this virus could potentially die from it. Many people have survived, but, I think 467,000 people have recovered and 100,000 people have died. That's close to a 25% death rate. That's shocking. And we don't know a lot about the virus either. At first everyone was like, well, it doesn't hurt kids. And then we find that there's more than 100 children, between the ages of 2 and 22 in the New York area who are suffering from an inflammatory immune system syndrome of some kind. That's putting them in the hospital. That's killing some children. 5-6 weeks after they were exposed to the virus. So things are happening at a rapid pace, and the level of denial is still breathtaking.
Well, okay. Well, thank you very much, Terry.
Answer your question there? I don't
You did.
Okay.
So thank you very much for taking the time to have to talk with me and to share your thoughts. This recording is going to be added to the other recordings in our drive, and then will also be shared on the social media and YouTube, because we want to also create a campaign to let people know what we are doing in terms of our performing human rights. So I do appreciate your contribution very much, and let's stay in touch.
Yeah, it's great to be back in touch with you, and I'm excited with the success of Attic Rep and all the amazing things that you've done. I mean, I remember, when we first met, you guys were still performing inside the studio Black Box Theater at Trinity University, and now you're down on the river, and I hope that you continue to do the important work that you do in San Antonio, and I hope that you have a robust return when this crisis lifts, and for everything you're doing.
Thank you, and thank you for all you're doing also. So my love to your family, and we'll talk soon.